introduce yourself first and then go through any, slides that you have by using share screen. And basically, if you can sort of keep to maybe 30 minutes, or if you need a little longer, that's fine for your presentation, because we'd like to have half of the time be for Q&A. And then for Q&A, I've asked that everyone, I'll just reiterate really briefly for people that just joined, is that if you can wait for me to call your name and then unmute yourself, ask the question, and then mute yourself immediately after, that would be great. But yeah. All right, Max, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself now. For the next 30 minutes, no one's going to say anything. So please feel free to get started.
All right, great. Thank you. I'm excited to talk with you all. Trans tech startups are a space I've been passionate about for a while. Back in 2009, got very interested in what made startups successful and what was this kind of emerging management science of entrepreneurship, and ended up working with some of the early forefathers of the lean startup movement. Was working with Steve Blank at Stanford, and ended up dropping out to start the Startup Genome Project. So I'll be sharing data and some history from that project, and some of the ways that it's been evolving since. A new book project that we've been working on, where I'll be sharing some key ideas and frameworks that we've developed that I actually haven't shared publicly in a while, so or much at all. So early preview of that. And I've been also very interested in trans tech because well, there are a lot of startups out there. Not all of them get me excited. The ones that are particularly working on the evolution of consciousness in our economic systems and really moving the ball forward are the ones I'm most excited about helping. So I will jump into some slides. So this is called the Startup Science Map and Key Patterns for Trans Tech Success. I've noticed as we've been advising a number of trans tech companies over the years. So as many of you have noticed, there's been an explosion in technology entrepreneurship over the last decade. Used to be more or less confined to a few startup ecosystems like Boston and Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv, but there's really been a huge explosion of entrepreneurship all over the world. And a large part of that is due to the cost reduction in what it takes to start a company, and the access to capital, and now a lot of the access to knowledge about what makes startups successful and how to run it. It's evolving, but we do have a problem, which is that how we manage startups today, we're not that great at. So more than 90% of startups fail primarily due to self-destruction rather than competition. And even as an industry, the return of venture capital as an asset class has been negative 2%. So although there have been some huge winners, most of the returns are concentrated there, and where the success almost gets pulled out of the companies due to the size of the market. So we see the root of this poor performance as that the field of entrepreneurship as a management science is in its infancy, that we have a management science for how to run large companies. That is what developed over the last few hundred years, starting with the East India Trading Company was when modern corporations really got formed. And then about 150 years after that, those patterns started to get codified and recognized by people like Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan and Frederick Winslow Taylor, and all of those got then spread in management schools around the world, and we've gotten quite good at running large companies. But in terms of how to run startups, that's relatively new. Tech startups in their current form really emerged in the 1970s, and a number of serial entrepreneurs, kind of a couple decades in, started to figure out patterns from doing several companies, and that has really supported this emerging blossoming field of entrepreneurship as a management science that's known as customer development and lean startup and growth hacking. And one of our focuses has been how can this field evolve and become more mature and organized. That we saw a lot of confusion about how all these different frameworks, how all these different pieces of entrepreneurship fit together, and sort of set out to work on contributing to that organization. So in 2010, we started the Startup Genome Project, and over a couple of years ended up gathering the world's largest data set of early stage startups with about 30,000 companies on 200 attributes. And we released reports on what made startups success, why they failed. We put that out through a number of outlets, and it was quite popular. That ended up evolving into two different companies. One is called the Startup Genome Project, which is now focused primarily on ecosystem level success and ecosystem development. And the other is called Compass, which use some of the models and frameworks we developed to go in the vertical of supporting e-commerce companies with making sense of their data. And that was acquired a couple years ago. So now we've working on a new piece of that, which is called Startup Science. And our goal is, how can we lay some of the core foundations for the management science of entrepreneurship? How do we radically increase the effectiveness of startups over the next number of decades that can enable entrepreneurs to build a flourishing economy, which is more important than ever as the pace of change speeds up. I know Nicole has talked about the exponential rate of change in tech, which drives more and more need for innovation and for product cycles to quicken, and disruption opportunities to be much more prevalent in all sorts of industries. So our goals for the Startup Genome and Startup Science have been to lay this foundation, create a comprehensive model of a startup, test and improve that with data, release reports, and incorporate it into software. And so we're kind of in our next cycle of that. If we come back to why do startups fail, what we found is about 70% fail to what we call premature scaling, was 20% to dysfunctional scaling, and only 10% really grow in alignment and succeed. I'm going to take you basically through how we think about startup, synthesizing a lot of the wisdom and expert frameworks into kind of an integrated system. So roughly, we see a startup as an organism that interacts with the environment. There are 4 core stages of development: discovery, validation, efficiency, and scale. And the exit criteria, or kind of key milestones for those stages, are, which you may have heard a fair amount about, is discovery is problem solution fit, where you're looking to understand whether the problem you think you're solving is one that users actually have, and whether the solution hypothetically solves that problem. In validation, you'll be building and really putting your ideas to the test and seeing if you can get to product market fit. In the efficiency stage, it's the focus is on a lot of unit economics and cultural efficiency, and really preparing the organization to scale. And then in the scale stage, you're stepping on the gas pedal. We break down the company into a variety of different dimensions in how they're organized. So the core foundation is legal. You need that to be able to take in money. Then you're taking in, then there's the finance dimension, the team, product, customer relationship, and traction, and get into more of those later. So if you plot that on a matrix, you're then able to see this kind of interaction between the traction stage and the internal behavioral stage. So this is how we look at whether a company is aligned or not. So you're not required, and many companies don't, to have what stage you're at internally be aligned with what amount of traction you have. So you could be have not released a product, but have some dimensions of the company kind of out of balance. And so balance is really a key concept. So in the life cycle of companies, to kind of zoom out and relate it to knowledge you may already be familiar with, after the scale stage is the sustain, maintain, and decline. So that's a company going through its more complete life cycle, and in the sustain, maintain stages are where most traditional business school knowledge applies to. And one of the main areas of founder confusion and startup failure is applying ideas, lessons, methodologies from the wrong stage. So one example of premature scaling was, this was in kind of early, around 2010 when we put out the first premature scaling report, was a startup called Color, had a bunch of successful serial entrepreneurs. They raised like a $40 million pre-launch round from Sequoia and thought that they could just kind of hit the gas pedal right away on scale, because they were in a they were tapping into a lot of key trends like social, mobile, and local. Ultimately, they only were in the traction stage of problem solution fit, because when they released their product, they had a big launch with the royal wedding. People were confused by the use cases and what problem they were actually solving. And so they had a huge amount of, they'd already scaled up their team on a lot of different dimensions, and it's very hard for a company to recover. So that's, don't have time to go into too much of detail of different companies. Friendster is another popular example where they dysfunctionally scaled. So their traction was out in the scale stage, but they ended up failing due to and getting passed by Facebook due to having very long page load times. And so that's where we see on the product dimension, they were lagging back in really validation. So some of the page load times got up to be many minutes long. And so one way of there was actually a problem along the team dimension. They had cultural issues and just weren't able to execute well fast enough. There was a lot of executive turnover. And so oftentimes when there's problems on one dimension, the problem really lies a layer deeper. The ideal company, as you would move through these different stages, would keep all of these dimensions in alignment as you move through discovery, validation, efficiency, and scale. It's useful to kind of take a step back and say, okay, why are developmental stages necessary? One of the reasons they are is because startups are exposed to extreme uncertainty. That there are a lot of unknown variables. That what happens for what characterizes a more traditional business and mature company is that they know who their customers are, they know why they buy, they know their unit economics, and so everything there's a lot of certainty. It's about execution. Whereas startups, there are a ton of uncertain variables, nearly all of them, and changing any one could change many of the others. And so if you get even a little bit wrong, that can that leads to a lot of retracing steps and a lot of waste and loss. And so what you're primarily trying to do by breaking things down into stages and approaching this more systematically and scientifically is to reduce uncertainty, which reduces risk. Because when you have incorrect assumptions, that leads to the misallocation of resources and bad decisions and ultimately failure. So startups can reduce uncertainty by treating your plan as a set of hypotheses and going one stage at a time and really understanding what you're solving for in your business at each stage of development. Let's see. So as you want to move through these stages while keeping the whole system in balance. So startup's competitive advantage is speed versus other types of organizations. But it's important to keep the whole system in balance. Effectively, the kind of clock is being reset every 18 or 24 months, where you need to hit a series of traction milestones and raise at a higher valuation. Otherwise, you end up in a kind of no man's land that's very difficult for startups to make it through. So you can fail really at any particular stage by getting out of alignment. Even we found in our data, even sort of small degrees of misalignment can lead to a startup failing and self-destructing. So now we'll look at some of the data about how we found startups who were in alignment, which we call in this data set consistent versus inconsistent, and how they performed in this startup genome data set. So we see that all the startups that were consistent, or all the startups that were inconsistent, did not make it to the 1 to 10 million and 10 million plus. And so most of the startups that were misaligned kind of topped out in this 10 to 100K range. Their user growth was also much slower. Startups that stayed aligned, their user growth was slower in the beginning, but ended up increasing as they went on. The valuations really spike in the scale stage for startups that stayed aligned throughout. So taking this approach of really being systematic about your approach to company creation takes patience and diligence, but and it can seem like the companies that are prematurely scaling are doing better because they often get in a kind of temporary co-creative hype cycle with their investors, where they believe their own hype, and it leads to some early spikes in valuation, but ultimately is not sustainable. And this shows up in the funding metrics as well. So next set is data on identifying premature scaling. Don't have time to discuss the different types of startups in too much detail, but roughly in our data set, we broke down different types of companies based on the complexity of their customer interaction. A lot of that is approximated by the cost of acquiring customers and the price of the product. So type 3 are more like enterprise, and type 1 are more like consumers generally. And what we see from here is that companies that were prematurely scaling often placed a much higher focus on getting their companies to pay for their product. So there was more of an experimental approach where companies that ended up scaling in an aligned fashion saw how to work with that getting paid users was just one form of experimentation and one form of validation, where too much focus on revenue early on ends up often being a distraction or some type of premature scaling. We saw that companies that were prematurely scaled or were inconsistent also outsourced a lot larger percentage of their team, which in large part is due to less of a focus on learning by those companies. So when all of the team is together and part of the core company, there's more of a focus on learning than execution, and that's what that's a proxy for. We see that companies that are aligned were much more focused on customer development than product development, or even split down the middle. And that's because knowing what to build is much more important than just building. They also wrote much less code and found cheaper ways to validate their ideas. The self-reported valuation also of companies that prematurely scaled was much higher. It's an interesting fact. There also was a much higher focus on customer acquisition by prematurely scaled startups, and had much higher customer acquisition costs. Here are 7 signs of failure for companies that is kind of useful for this set of data for entrepreneurs just starting out, about what we found kind of marks of success in that. So companies that where the founders were working full-time had much better performance, and which showed up in the amount of funding they were able to raise and user growth. 2 to 3 founders we found was optimal. Starting company alone also was made one much more likely hire to prematurely scale. The number of technical co-founders was a big piece. So having at least not having at least having one technical co-founder is key. And that showed up in the data. And if you want to go through more of this data, you can get the two reports that this is based on from me or Nicole afterwards. I believe I shared the links with them. So then we looked at different teams based on what team one is in, whether you're in the automator, the social transformer, the integrator, or the challenger, would determine your team composition would being aligned with type. So this is the idea of founder market fit, not just product market fit, being a big predictor of success. And so we found that business, this is how different, if your team was business heavy, then you did much better with particular types of startups. And based on whether you're technical or balanced, you did better with particular types. We found that startups that listen to their customers and peers based on how well they track metrics had a big correlation with success. We found pivoting was important and had a strong correlation with success, but not too often. So 1 to 2 pivots ended up being ideal. A pivot is basically where you change one major portion of your business model based on something you learned from customers through customer development. And then here was data that we've already looked at based on prematurely scaling, that companies that scaled after product market fit ended up doing much better. So I want to go back to the model and give people a high resolution look about these different dimensions of the company. How am I doing on time? Okay. So you can break each of these dimensions down to the component parts, and you also want alignment within each of these dimensions. So customer relationship is made up of customer development, marketing, sales, and customer success. Product is made up of infrastructure, application, analytics, applied psychology, and design. This is where we've mapped team onto the integral quadrants of looking at leadership, culture, individuals' health and well-being, and organizational governance and decision-making. And same thing mapped on this graph. Team is also, you can look at human resources, operations, and recruiting. And finance, you've got your funding, your financial systems, and financial communication. What we're trying to do here is give a sense of the organization as this going through this developmental progression, and that all the variables that one needs to keep track of and keep in balance in order for the company to be successful. One of the most important frameworks for companies in the discovery and validation stage is this one, which we've synthesized a lot of the key variables one needs to keep track of to get to problem solution fit and product market fit. So roughly, companies, the approach we recommend is you first put down all of your assumptions about, in this chart, about who you think your customers are, what your market is, what the customer segment is, what are the different archetypes and personas, what are each of those different archetypes and personas, what are their needs, how does that break down into specific use cases that solve those needs, how do those use cases break down into individual features, what's the value proposition and product messaging that comes as a result of those needs and use cases, what is the competitive alternatives and status quo to your solution. That's often a big barrier for people to adopt it. And then we look at pricing and also some behavior change theory about what actually makes someone take an action. And so when we work with companies, we'll have them put all their assumptions down here, and the customer development process is to figure out whether your ideas about what you think go in here is actually correct. So as you start to talk with users, as you put your product out in the world and get data, this chart gets iterated and eventually kind of reads like a kind of clear statement of your business and why it works. And it sort of allows one to take a very scientific approach to understanding, okay, where in the chain is something not true. And so oftentimes when I meet with entrepreneurs, this won't even make logical sense. Like something in here, like the persona won't exist, or the need won't be real, or the competitive alternative is too high, something like that. And so they go through all this effort of like building and scaling a company, But if they just took the exercise of writing all their assumptions down on this piece of paper and going to talk with customers, they'd find out that something in here wasn't true. Here's a way that we kind of sync it with agile development. So the features that come out of there end up getting prioritized. Another key piece of customer development is making sure you interpret your personas based on a life cycle adoption curve. So you really want to be finding the innovators and early adopters and not get stuck listening too heavily to the type of people who are not going to adopt your product early. So contextualizing feedback that way is key, and your data. And then this comes from behavior change model, which is from BJ Fogg at Stanford, which is, why does someone take an action? And the basic idea is their motivation needs to be high enough, the ability to perform that action needs to be low enough, and that's when, and then they need to be triggered. And so if they're below the line, they will not take the action. If they're above the line, they will. And so a lot of product fine-tuning is around making it easier for users to perform an action or increasing their motivation. And there are a variety of like levers and triggers. They've also broken down all the different types of behaviors. So whether you want someone to just do a new behavior, whether you want them to increase it or decrease it, and there's a whole matrix for how to really approach what type of behavior you want users to do as part of your core product. Don't really have time to go through example charts right now, but this is for like a startup like LinkedIn, where you can kind of put all these assumptions out in a chart. We often do it with a Google Doc. And it's good for team communication and getting everyone aligned. There's a larger complete life cycle that is important for trans tech startups in particular, which are the stages that come before discovery. So prior to discovery, there's the R&D phase, the applied research, peer research, and paradigm creation. It's kind of working backwards. Most startups today are just beginning in the discovery stage, especially if you're doing any hard R&D or in one of these earlier stages. And that really changes a lot of the assumptions and how one moves through the life cycle. In the book, we talk about the more complete life cycle, and so how it all fits together. And there's even kind of higher resolution. One can go on the different scale stages and how they move to different orders of magnitude. So if you've come across Reid Hoffman's Blitz scaling book, he goes into that in more detail. So that's how one can, if your company is there when you get there, really understand what's happening at these different orders of magnitude. Orders of magnitude being on team size. So when you go from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and in revenue, when you're going from 100K to a million to 10 million, 10 million to 100 million, and most companies level off and don't make it all the way to like scale 4. They don't have $1 billion product, but the market size dictates when it begins to level off. Now, if you're developing multiple products, you can also see this in a fractal way. This is how we apply it to corporate innovation, in that every product is actually moving through its own series of stages of development. That's a topic for deeper conversation. But the zone most of you all will be in are these 4 stages. So the applied research, R&D, discovery and validation, and how you fit across these charts. What we've seen advising a number of trans tech companies is that there's a number of core ways that they have fallen into traps. So a lot of trans tech companies have seen are not able to clearly identify what stage of the life cycle they're in. So they'll be doing applied research or R&D, but they'll be taking tactics and taking advice as if they are in the discovery validation stage. And that, particularly in alignment with their team and alignment with investors, can lead to a lot of premature scaling. So investors, especially with the popularity of the lean startup, have pressured a lot of companies to perhaps iterate and grow faster than they're able to, and they're not really aware of these prior stages and what companies need to do differently there. So if you we've seen companies take on a large amount of money, they may raise a Series A style round where they raise a couple million because they're doing kind of advanced tech that maybe would previously have been done in university labs and is now privately funded. but then they'll go, the investors will think because they've raised a $5 million round, that they need to behave like other startups who've raised $5 million and hire a big marketing team and put a bunch of emphasis on branding and really prematurely scale out that customer relationship dimension or scale out that team dimension. And that is a big error. It essentially is it's a form of premature scaling that causes all the dysfunctions that I've discussed some of. So that's letting the funding round dictate how the other dimensions go. And if you're in the pre-discovery stages, it's really important to exercise patience. The discovery stage already takes much longer than most founders expect. Discovery stage in our data took at least 8 months, and R&D and applied research can take even longer. And so one analogy we've given when people are working on hard new tech is to think of the phase space in which they're searching. So another way that pressure from investors and from founders, self-imposed, can force suboptimal conditions for founders is by them pursuing local maximum. So they pursue, there's some use case for their tech, but it's not really the best one. But because it's low-hanging fruit, they go into that early, and then they get trapped by that and get trapped by being in that small market. Now, sometimes it makes sense, but it really needs to be looked at with a larger strategic perspective of how do we give ourselves the patience to find problem solution fit in the biggest markets, or how are we going to kind of leapfrog our way? What's the plan of maybe we have one product that will get into scale 1 or scale 2, and that gives us the resources when the market timing is right to then go for a bigger market. And that is kind of a rough, fast overview through this world of startup science. We are writing the book for this right now, so anyone who's interested in reading about this in more detail, and taking a look at some of the early drafts, we've finished writing 6 chapters that cover a lot of this in more detail. You can email me, now great, did it pretty much exactly in 30 minutes. So would love to move to questions.
Yay. Okay, I'll be the moderator. So the person with the name Bidemi, please unmute yourself and ask your question. You had your hand raised. Okay, maybe that didn't work. Okay. Okay. How about Ryan? Ryan W. Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good morning. Thank you. What is your definition of a technical co-founder? Thank you.
In this case, we were looking at, it was for more straightforward startups. So, a technical co-founder is someone who's able to build a software product. The basic map, all the core competencies on your team to be able to build a prototype and build product market fit and get to product market fit and have those team members properly incentivized as founders or early employees with equity.
So this would entail a coder or a programmer?
Yeah.
Ideally.
So if you're doing hardware, if you're in hardware, then you need those competencies too.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, Max, I'm going to ask on behalf of Vedami. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. His question is, what is the ideal time for discovery?
So I wouldn't, thinking of time would be as what are rough guidelines, but I wouldn't hold oneself to the time. So the goal is when you feel confident enough that you have problem solution fit. So you've articulated all your assumptions, you have enough users who are like, yeah, you understand my problem, and if you built this, then I would be a very happy user or a paying customer, depending on type of product. In the report, we go through the different timelines for the different types of startups about how long each stage took. So we found though that so it took about 8 months longer, I believe, than most founders expected. So I hope that answers it.
Great. Matt Holland, you have your hand up. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Max. First, thanks for the amazing session. And my next question is, so we don't have a technical founder. We're going to push past 7 figures here by the end of November in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so my concern is, I mean, I'm sure that we're a very small subset of that number of succeeding because we don't have a technical founder. What are your thoughts on approaching investors when this, I mean, I pretty much have become the technical founder because it came from my brain, and I walked through the entire development process, implementation. I do most of the onboarding with my team. So what is your thoughts on how to verbalize that to investors? Because a lot of times they get turned off initially when they hear there's no technical founder.
What is the challenge of finding one?
Not the challenge of finding one. At this point, we haven't really needed one because we have an entire development team that work for us, and some amazing people who wireframed everything out and got everything out of my brain 4 years ago. And then I pretty much have stepped into that role because I understand the front end, the back end, and everything else, but I couldn't code it.
Yeah.
If I code, it's going to be, everybody's in trouble.
Yeah. I think, you've already beat the odds by making it this far. So what we're showing correlation rather than causation, and there's always exception. One of the exceptions. I think it's important if all of the team is outsourced, to have someone who's bought in for the long term with equity, who has that like level of mind share and care for making sure everything is done right, is lined up with the right incentives, and finding that person, but keep going, and I think you'll, given the amount of progress you've made, and some investors will be able to look over it, others will still have their biases. So a mix of overcoming the limitation in how you describe the story, and then also finding that person. It doesn't need to be a co-founder. Now you're basically talking a VP of engineering. Okay,
because we have like our CXPO, she's in charge of kind of patient experience, and she can do some coding, and then our cybersecurity, he also can do some coding, but no, I mean, we leave it up to our development team because we're HIPAA compliant. So we only have about 2 to 3 people who have access to the back end of the system just for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, there may be particulars to your market as well. Talking to other founders who are in your particular market segment and the regulatory issues about what they've done can be valuable as well. Like what's an ideal team setup, but considering you're at 7 figures and then able.
But will be end of November when all the government things come in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely want. You most likely want to look at how you can bring a team in-house, and that's also interfacing with outsourced team for increased speed. But if you're going to continue to grow, right, like that's become a big Series A, Series B, Series C funded startup, you want to make that start bringing at least a core competency in-house.
Thank you, Max. I appreciate it.
Great. Let's move on to the next question. Mark with the C, you had a question.
Oh, hey. Thanks. Yeah, I have a sneaky suspicion that my company is on a local maximum. We make music practice software, and we're helping kind of goal-oriented musicians, but eventually we want to introduce a new paradigm for music practice. So what are some ways that we can approach like expanding and testing that space of maxima?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's you're looking to find global maximum. It's a mix of foresight, trying to see what are the emerging trends in the market, things that are going to be big in a few years, and how can you, or big now, and tap into it. So one problem with just pure customer development is that still can often lead to local maximum, because you're asking users what they're aware of. So if you don't spot, if you don't have vision, if you don't have foresight, that's what leads to those big global maximum opportunities. So that's one art that's not talked about enough, but it's a mix of coming up with some type of visionary hypothesis, and then going through the customer development process to be like, okay, does this make sense? Do users agree?
To test the visionary hypothesis, you mean?
Yeah. And you'll need to, or does that make sense, or what would you, what's missing?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think sometimes it's hard to test these new paradigms with people because it's a process of kind of bringing them through their beliefs and emotional relationship with music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like a lot of it's looking at how will people want to experience music in the future? How can you come up with ways of prototyping what you think it's going to be 5 years out? I mean, it also might be that some tech and directions people have gone down, it is more niche, and so accepting that and accepting all the economics around that, around how much money you can raise, what the ultimate team size can be for a particular niche, is just something that needs to be done. And then once you get a team, and let's say that business tops out at a few million revenue a year, well, now you have a team that's kind of in the scale 1 phase, and you can be creative about using those resources to come up with something new or in an adjacent space that could be much bigger. Another piece is, if markets are slow to develop, really paying attention to market timing and knowing when to be when to be patient and when to be in more of a holding pattern. So based on different market types and their maturity will determine how quickly one can move through those stages. So if a market's ready right now, it might be blowing up and you can accelerate through like discovery, validation, efficiency, scale 1, 2, 3 super quick. Whereas others, people might be developing for a long time and have to wait, a couple of years. And if they press the gas pedal too early, nothing happens.
Okay, cool.
So
yeah. Sorry to cut you off, but let's move on to the next question. So from Ryan, I'll just read it. As someone in the very early stage R&D, as a sole technical founder, what skills should I look in co-founders based on, what the research you've done in the Startup Genome?
What skills in co-founders on the technical side or the business?
No, for a technical co-founder. So I am a technical co-founder. What should I be looking for in my co-founders?
Well, you want the founding team to cover all the core competencies that are needed to get to product market fit. And that's kind of, a lot depends on what product you're building and what market. And a huge portion is the personal dimension and how well you get along with people. I mean, one of the main reasons companies fail is due to co-founder conflict is one of the biggest. So a huge portion is the interpersonal relationship, not just the skills. The book Founder's Dilemma by Noam Wasserman, he's done some great work in detail on founder relationships and founder conflicts. I would recommend looking to that. We haven't gone too deep into like all the different skills needed. Our approach is, how do we create this meta model that shows how all the different dimensions fit together. So I'm sure there's also been a lot of other great work done on co-founder picking.
Cool. Next one is Corey Julin. I'm not, yeah. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks. Thanks, Max. I really appreciate your presentation. So my question is, we're building a consumer wearable. And so when it comes to hardware and when you're moving through discovery phase, how do you do that validation of the market? So there's the early research in the discovery phase, but sort of that validation. Are you maybe you could talk about that? Are you looking at doing some sort of trials with a subset of people, or maybe you could talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, a large part of the validation stage is actual data with users. So you don't have product market fit until the product is in their hands. So I think a lot of the question would actually be better framed is, how do you do, when you're in the R&D and discovery phase, how do you do customer development to make sure that when you get the product to market that you haven't created a bunch of waste by building the wrong things with expensive hardware or software built around that expensive hardware. It's tricky. I mean, there's a lot of there's books on all the different types of customer development experiments. There was one that Tristan Kromer just put out, did a whole collective of book organized like 100 different customer development experiments. So a lot of it is figuring out, okay, what customer development experiment is going to help us figure out the assumption, get the data that we need to minimize waste. If you've minimized waste, then you've done it successfully. Mainly, you're trying to prevent going and building something and then realizing that it was wrong. And even when companies get there, they'll often realize, if I'd run this experiment or asked these questions, I could have figured it out much more cheaply. But some of it, startups are experiments themselves, and you just have to run the experiment of a startup to see if it's successful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Max. And by the way, we did I hosted a pre-session on customer development before the program started. That's the first video on our YouTube if people missed that. I just went through a very simple overview. Our next question, Juan Romo. Juan?
Hello, Max. Hello,
Yeah.
Max. How are you? Yeah, I have my own startup, but also I was helping other companies that also do a new business. And the technical part was very, very critical for them, as any startup. And they actually lost a lot of money in the beginning to set up the architecture and set up the plan for the project, they set up the agile methodology for the development, the selection of the team, and so on. So there is some methodologies right now moving all this startup movement, which is the design thinking and agile, DevOps, that actually are being part of the deployment of these technologies into the cloud. How critical you see these implementations, and in which stage these methodologies should apply?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think startups should be thinking about doing the minimum amount of process that is necessary, that their emphasis needs to be speed and validated learning, getting through the stages. That a lot of process is designed to, it's about increasing efficiency. So a lot of that is happening at the efficiency and scale stages, which one should start to think about process. Doing things in an ad hoc manner can often be faster unless there's a lot of complexity to manage. So the higher the complexity on the project, the more there's a need for process. That a lot be driven by the technical complexity of the product. But I think startups should be striving to minimize that, to emphasize speed and emphasize what is the key traction milestone at the stage that they're at. So design thinking is kind of a hybrid methodology between a lot of design thinking has pieces of customer development, and it also is along the product dimension. So it kind of straddles those two in our model. Agile development is specifically around product development, and yeah, I mean, almost no startup should be doing waterfall development at this stage, because that's when that's what's used when there's high certainty and you know exactly what you're building. Where agile is what's useful when there are when the solution and problem are both unknown.
Cool.
But yeah, overall, we're looking. Our focus is how we develop this larger meta model that can define when these methodologies apply. And a lot of that depends, which I didn't get into in this talk, but is in the book, is about the underlying typologies and taxonomies that underlie this. So it's about what type of startup you're in. What you can look at. One way we look at is each of the different. I think I have a break this down here. Like here's some of the typologies. So each of the dimensions have about 20 different types of different combinations. So there's 20 different customer acquisition channels, 20 different product types, and 20 different revenue streams. And that's the underlying variables that dictate what are the methodologies that apply. So that's like a much bigger project that we see what the field needs to do to get organized. So I know, okay, can I do design thinking when I have a product in R&D in like the neurotech space, and how could we organize around, is it different for neurotech than consumer web?
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Next question, Suresh Shazwaran.
Hey, Max. Yeah, it's Suresh. You're close. Just at what point does culture become vital, and kind of why?
Mm-hmm. Well, so yeah, cultures, we track that. It's like on the team dimension, it's a key piece. It's the lower left quadrant in integral theory. I see in the discovery and validation stage, it's mostly about founders and their interpersonal intelligence, and like how they get along, and they're setting the culture. The more a lot of the like explicit cultural practices are a lot dictated by the size of the team, and so like, when do you start doing 360 reviews, or when do you start doing town hall meetings? Yeah, we've worked with some executive coaches to map out what they would do from a cultural perspective and a leadership perspective at the different stages. So I haven't personally focused that much on it, but I think so much is about picking the right people, and that they're people who are values aligned and who are coming from like the same level of consciousness. When you're under 10 people, most of it will be dictated by that. Any like tactics one does is not going to make anywhere near a difference. It's just selecting the right people who are in it for the right reasons.
And I probably should have started with this, but do you have like a definition for culture, something that's more tangible than just the word that is kind of thrown around?
I don't off the top of my head.
No worries.
I definitely have friends who I would turn to when we, go to like co-write that chapter.
Of course. Thank you.
Oh, hi. I think there's a couple questions left, Max, but I think I will just sort of summarize them. I don't know if you covered this in your research, but it seems like 3 of the questions are quite related, and it's about research and how to approach investors when they're just in a research stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a challenging thing to do because a lot of investors are used to companies that have traction. So I think we're in a space where there's more capital that's like traditionally it's been funded publicly by universities and by grants, and companies should use that as much as possible. Now a lot of companies like haven't been able to take off in that environment or haven't had grants for what they want to do. So it's really finding investors who are willing to go that early in the life cycle, and who really who oftentimes will be more angel investors, but and need to get the company to a certain stage before they're ready to do that. I've noticed that when I've seen companies get venture capital in the R&D stage, then often the investors in a lot of cases have pressured the companies to prematurely scale because that's what they're used to. They wrote a $5 million check, so they want the company to behave like a Series A scale 1 company. So I think some of that is the work of TransTech as an organization and conference to find as sort of communities of interest to organize the investors who believe in a market and want to come in at that earliest stage. And then I hope frameworks and models like ours can then help both entrepreneurs and investors to have realistic expectations about how should that capital be deployed to hit what milestones.
Yeah, I completely agree. I actually wrote my own answer in the chat, but yeah, very few investors will fund at that stage, and grants are much better actually. One last question, 457. Have you got any information regarding use of spiral dynamics in the integral model you use?
I'm very familiar with spiral dynamics. I mean, the TransTech company I'm building is focused on how we put the integral model of consciousness in our tools to have that as the infrastructure. We're focused on the Enneagram personality model right now. And so spiral dynamics has certainly informed a lot of this. It's being more directly incorporated in the body of work known as reinventing organizations. I'm talking with some of those folks about how we can collaborate, since they don't kind of explicitly have a stage and life cycle model in their work. But roughly, it's actually using the startup science approach that we're articulating here would be hard for someone who is not at teal consciousness, which is the systemic level, because it requires thinking in this sort of systemic, non-linear way of balancing many variables to be in harmony. So that's one aspect of it. And then and that's what I found is sort of entrepreneurs who are coming from the other levels in spiral dynamics of amber, orange, and green, or blue, kind of wouldn't resonate with this type of approach.
Got it. I think that's all we have time for, Max. Thank you so much for your time. Could you tell everyone here how they may find you online? Do you have like social media or whatever? How can they follow your work and be more involved? I know quite a few people have already said they would love to be a reader, but anything else the community can do for you or with you?
Yeah, and they can email me at max@maxmarmer.com. I will probably be sharing these slides soon. I can share to some people privately, but basically they'll be going out as part of this. We'll be putting an early version out of this book in as an ebook before it goes to publisher. So, and a lot of these slides are in it. So can share that with people, and you can friend me on Facebook or LinkedIn. I don't use Twitter too much these days. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone for attending, and then thank you again, Max. I will be putting up this video on our unlisted YouTube playlist. So thanks everyone.
One last idea, if we want to follow in discussion, could be a specific Slack channel or something to continue the conversation.
Oh yeah, Max, feel free to create a Slack channel and then say in general that it's been created, and I'm sure lots of people would be happy to join.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.